Hey, want to thank you for tuning in once again. Um, uh, Today, I wanted to share a few thoughts with you from 1 Peter chapter number 4. Um, I've been kind of bouncing around in different passages and looking how the different writers approach some things, but Peter says to the churches, he says, "Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality and passions and drunkenness and orgies and drinking parties and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you." Well, I thought that was interesting because the tendency for us is to think that these are the worst of times and things have never been this bad. But apparently, human nature has been doing its selfish, sensual, self-interested, self-pleasing things for all time. But when Christ becomes life for us, the apostles, whether it's Peter here or John or Paul, they all remind us that part of being born again is that we have a new source for life. So we're not looking for life in the same things. And neither are we trying to distract ourselves from the trials of life in the same ways. But as children of the King, our focus is no longer self-pleasing, self-seeking pleasure, but we seek the King and his kingdom. And so Peter says, because Jesus suffered in the flesh, because Jesus went to the cross to become sin for us, he did this so that we would no longer be slaves to sin. That we would no longer have to be servants of sin or do the will of our fleshly desires. He says, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. He says, so you got to think the way Jesus thinks. Now, I always like to remind people because he didn't tell you that you need to feel the same way Jesus felt. That soul of ours is made up of our thinker, feeler, and our chooser. And we live in a world where it seems like the feeler is the dominant force in our chooser. So why do we do what we do and go where we go and spend and give in the ways because we feel like it. And we Westerners are not exempt from this at all. Most of the people that I know who profess to be Christians, they still pretty much do what they want to do because that's what they want to do. And Peter says, arm yourself. Meaning, Paul used the phrase, put on the whole armor of God. He said, but this is your protection to think the same way Jesus thought. And Jesus tells us that he only did what he saw the Father doing. You see, behind every choice that we make for what we do and how we live and how we entertain ourselves and what we spend on and how we give and where we go shouldn't be determined by our feeler, but our thinker. We need to make sure that we have armed ourselves and that we are thinking on the things that are good and true and pure and right, that we're thinking on things above, that we're thinking about the things that edify and support, encourage and express love. We need to be thinking the same way Jesus did. That's how we arm and protect ourselves. He says, whoever has suffered this has ceased from sin. So when we think about the right thing, we find ourselves making the right choices and living free. Verse 2 says, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. So once again, from a different little perspective, friends, as a child of God, as someone who has put their faith in the finished work of Jesus Christ, what is your passion? What is your desire? Are you still living just for you? Just for what you want, what you desire? Because he says, I have something far better, far more enriching, far more fulfilling. He says that the time for living for human passions, that's past. But now we live for the will of God. Verse 3 tells us, he says, man, we lived enough time in the past just doing what we wanted, and that suffice. And he goes, your friends in the world, they're going to mock you. They're going to scorn you because you don't go along with their orgies and their drunkenness and their selfishness, their lawless idolatry, their drinking parties. He goes, but all that wasted time, that's past. And so I want to encourage you. Say, Lord, how do you want to live through me? I want to make sure that your feeler is not the dominant force in your chooser, but the thinker. And you're thinking like Jesus, that you've armed yourself, you've protected yourself so that your human passions, your flesh doesn't dominate your chooser and lead you into harm and destruction, but that your one passion is the will of God. Living in a responsive and dynamic relationship with the indwelling presence of God, because that is your divine privilege. Well, I hope that encourages you and that you'll pass it on. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to get updates. And I hope you'll share this in whatever medium you get it with someone that you love and want to encourage. Have a great day. Love you.